Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that doesn't usually make it into the heroic movie montages or high school history books. Food. Specifically, Spartan black broth. The infamous, blood-dark, and legendarily disgusting stew that was less about nourishment and more about pure, unadulterated discipline. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand Sparta, we must first understand its landscape. Not just the physical terrain, but the human geography that was shaped by a single, violent, and defining event. Our story does not begin with the glorious warriors of the classical age, but centuries earlier, in the murky twilight of the Greek Dark Ages. It begins with an invasion, a conquest that would forever divide the population of this land into two irreconcilable groups, the masters and the subjugated. This foundational act of violence is the key that unlocks the Spartan soul, for it instilled in them a deep and abiding fear that would become the architect of their unique and brutal society. The land we're talking about is Laconia, a long, fertile valley in the southern part of the Greek Peloponnese. It is a land of stark beauty, framed by two immense and forbidding mountain ranges, the Taygetus to the west and the Parnon to the east. The Eurotas River flows through its heart, creating a rich alluvial plain perfect for agriculture, a prize worth fighting for. In the late Bronze Age, during the time of the Trojan War, this was the heartland of the Mycenaean civilization, the legendary kingdom of Menelaus and Helen. But this civilization collapsed around 1200 BC, and in the chaotic centuries that followed, new peoples migrated into Greece. Among these were a hardy, Greek-speaking people known as the Dorians. Sometime around the 10th century BC, Dorian warbands pushed their way south into the Peloponnese. They were an iron-wielding people, aggressive, and well-organized. They swept into the Eurotas Valley and conquered it. The native inhabitants of the land, the descendants of the old Mycenaeans, were defeated and subjugated. These conquerors, the Dorians, would become the ruling class, the Spartiates. The conquered people would become their servants. In most other parts of Greece where such invasions occurred, a process of integration eventually took place. The conquerors and the conquered would slowly merge, intermarrying and creating a new, unified society. But in Laconia, this did not happen. The Dorian Spartans chose a different path. They did not integrate, they dominated. They established themselves as a permanent military aristocracy, living in a cluster of villages that would form the city-state of Sparta, while the original inhabitants were reduced to a state of servitude. This initial subjugation was solidified and expanded in the 8th century BC. Looking for more land to support their growing population, the Spartans turned their gaze west, across the formidable Taygetus mountain range, to the neighboring land of Messenia. Messenia was even more fertile than Laconia, a rich prize. In a series of long and brutal conflicts known as the Messenian Wars, the Spartans conquered this neighboring territory and subjugated its entire population as well. This conquest transformed Spartan society forever. They now controlled a vast and fertile territory, but they had also created a demographic time bomb. The Spartans were now a small alien ruling class, lords over a vast population of enslaved Greeks who hated them, who remembered their former freedom, and who vastly, terrifyingly outnumbered them. The ancient historian Herodotus tells us that the ratio was as high as 7-1. 7 enslaved people for every 1 Spartan man, woman, and child. This created the central, animating fear of all Spartan history, the terror of a massive slave revolt. Every Spartan lived their life in the shadow of this possibility. They knew that they were a tiny garrison, encamped in hostile territory, surrounded by a sea of resentment. A single moment of weakness, a single crack in their discipline could lead to a bloody uprising that would annihilate them completely. This was not a theoretical danger. In the 460s BC, a massive earthquake devastated Sparta, and the enslaved people seized the opportunity to rise up in a massive rebellion that nearly succeeded in destroying the Spartan state. The Spartans only survived through their legendary discipline and with the help of outside allies. The memory of this near cataclysm was burned into their collective psyche. This constant, knowing fear became the organizing principle of their state. Every institution, every law, every custom, no matter how strange or cruel it may seem to us, was designed to answer a single question: how does this help us maintain control over our slaves? How does this prevent a revolt? The answer they devised was to turn their entire society into a permanent military camp. They would transform themselves into the most disciplined, most formidable, and most ruthless warriors the world had ever seen. They would sacrifice everything else: art, commerce, literature, individual freedom, family life, on the altar of military readiness. They made a conscious decision to freeze their own cultural development. While other Greek cities like Athens and Corinth were developing vibrant cultures of philosophy, drama, and democracy, Sparta deliberately turned its back on these things. They saw them as luxuries, as distractions that would soften their fighting spirit and introduce dangerous, new ideas. They chose to become a closed, totalitarian society, obsessed with secrecy, conformity, and control. Their entire economic system was built on this foundation. The Spartan citizen, the Spartiate, was forbidden by law from engaging in any form of agriculture or commerce. To do so would be to distract from his one and only duty, to be a soldier. His food, his wealth, his very existence was provided for by the labor of the people he had enslaved. This allowed him to dedicate his entire life, from the age of 7 until the day he died, to the practice of war. He was a professional soldier in a world of amateurs, and this gave him a tremendous advantage. But it also made him utterly dependent on the very people he so feared. So, when we look at the strange customs of the Spartans, their brutal upbringing, their communal dining, the bizarre freedoms of their women, their laconic speech, we must not see them as isolated quirks. We must see them as the logical, if terrifying, products of a society founded on a deep and abiding paranoia. Sparta was a state built on a volcano, and its people lived in constant fear of its eruption. Their solution was to become as hard and unyielding as the rock of the mountains that surrounded them, to create a society that was, in itself, a weapon. This was a choice that would make them the masters of Greece for a time, but it was a choice that would also, in the end, lead to their own self-destruction. To understand the grand edifice of Spartan society, with its warrior kings and its disciplined hoplites, we must first go down into its foundations. And there, in the dark, we find not stone and mortar, but human beings, a vast, subjugated population, whose sweat and toil supported the entire structure, and whose presence generated the fear that shaped every aspect of Spartan life. These were the Helots, and they were the terrified and terrifying secret at the heart of the Spartan state. The term Helot is believed to have derived either from the town of Helots in Laconia, whose inhabitants were the first to be enslaved, or simply from a root word meaning captive. But their status was unique in the Greek world. They were not chattel slaves in the way that slaves in Athens were. An Athenian citizen might own a slave as his personal property, to be bought and sold at will. The Helots were not owned by individual Spartans. They were owned by the Spartan state itself. They were a collective underclass, a population of state-owned serfs, bound to the land they worked and assigned to individual Spartan households. After the conquest of Laconia and Messenia, the rich agricultural land was divided into hereditary estates or kleroi. Each Spartan citizen, a member of the elite Spartiate class, was granted one of these kleroi. This estate was his ticket to citizenship, the source of the wealth that allowed him to dedicate his life to being a soldier. But the Spartan did not work this land himself. Attached to each kleros was a group of Helot families. These families were not a random collection of individuals. They were communities with their own internal structures, who had lived on that land for generations before the Spartans arrived. The Helots' existence was defined by a single, crushing obligation. They were required to work the land of their Spartan master and to deliver to him a fixed and substantial portion of the harvest each year. The ancient writer Plutarch tells us that the quota was 70 bushels of barley for the master, 12 for his wife, and a set amount of wine and fruit. Whatever the Helot family could produce above and beyond this quota, they were allowed to keep for themselves. This small detail is crucial. It meant that unlike chattel slaves, the Helots could have a measure of private property. In a good year, a Helot family might have a small surplus. This gave them a tiny sliver of autonomy, but it also gave them something to lose, a factor the Spartans likely exploited to ensure their compliance. It also meant that the Spartans themselves were utterly dependent on this yearly tribute. If the Helots failed to produce, the Spartan master would be unable to make his required contribution to his communal dining hall, the Syssitia, and would lose his citizenship. The master was as bound to the Helot's labor as the Helot was to the master's land. The life of a Helot was one of degradation and constant, calculated humiliation. The Spartans went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the Helots never forgot their inferior status, to strip them of their dignity and their humanity. They were forced to wear humiliating clothing, typically a crude leather cap and a rough animal skin tunic, so that they would always be visually distinct from their masters. They were subjected to arbitrary beatings, not for any specific transgression, but simply to remind them of their powerlessness. Perhaps the most infamous of these rituals of humiliation involved forcing the Helots to become drunk. The Spartans themselves were famously sober and abstemious. They would compel the Helots to drink unmixed wine, a practice considered barbaric by the rest of the Greek world. and then drag them into the public dining halls, the Syssitia. There the Helots would be forced to stagger about, to sing obscene songs, and to perform ridiculous dances. The purpose of this cruel spectacle was twofold. It served as a form of public ridicule, shaming the Helots before their masters. But more importantly, it was a lesson for the Spartan youth who were present. This, their elders would say, is what it is to be a slave. This is the loss of self-control. This is what you must never become. The Helot was made into a negative role model, his debasement used as a tool for the education of the master class. The fear of a Helot uprising was so profound that it was institutionalized in the very declaration of the Spartan state. Each year, upon taking office, the 5 elected magistrates of Sparta, the ephors, would perform a solemn ritual. They would formally declare war on the Helot population. This was not a symbolic act. It was a legal and religious declaration that transformed the relationship between Spartan and Helot into one of perpetual warfare. It meant that a Spartan could kill a Helot at any time, without any reason, and incur no blood guilt, no religious pollution. It was a state-sanctioned open license to murder their own workforce. It gave the Spartans the legal framework to conduct a reign of terror against the people who sustained them. The most terrifying instrument of this terror was the infamous Spartan secret police, the Crypteia. The details of this institution are shrouded in secrecy and debate among ancient historians, but the general picture is chilling. The Crypteia was a select group of the most promising and ruthless young men from the Agoge, the Spartan training program. As a final test of their skills, they would be sent out from the city with nothing but a dagger and a minimal amount of food. They were instructed to hide during the day and to roam the countryside at night. Their mission was to spy on the Helot population and, more sinisterly, to assassinate any Helot who showed signs of being strong, intelligent, or defiant. Plutarch describes their mission starkly. They made their way to the roads and hid themselves, and by night they came down and murdered any Helot they caught. The Crypteia was a tool of preemptive terror. It was designed to cull the natural leaders from the Helot population, to eliminate anyone who might be capable of organizing a rebellion before they could become a threat. It also served as a brutal hardening process for the future leaders of the Spartan state, teaching them to kill in cold blood and to see the Helots not as people, but as a dangerous animal population that needed to be periodically thinned. Despite this relentless oppression, the Helots were not a broken or passive people. They maintained their own culture, their own religious practices, and a fierce, burning memory of their lost freedom. They were a constant source of trouble for their masters. They would engage in acts of sabotage, work slowdowns, and they would desert to the enemy whenever an invading army entered Laconian territory. The Spartans knew that the Helots were not just a workforce. They were an internal enemy, a fifth column waiting for its moment to strike. This constant internal war shaped Spartan foreign policy. The Spartans were famously reluctant to send their armies far from home or for long periods. Their primary concern was always the security of their own backyard. They lived as if in a state of permanent siege, not from a foreign enemy, but from the people who lived among them, who worked their fields, and who outnumbered them 7-1. The Helots were the foundation of Sparta, but it was a foundation built on terror, hatred, and the ever-present threat of a bloody and catastrophic revolt. Every aspect of the famed Spartan discipline, courage, and cruelty was a direct response to the existence of this terrified and terrifying foundation. In most societies, the birth of a child is a moment of profound joy and hope, a private affair for the family celebrating the continuation of its line. In Sparta, it was something else entirely. The birth of a child was not a private event, but a public one. It was not a cause for unconditional celebration, but a moment of cold and pragmatic judgment. For in Sparta, a child was not considered the property of its parents. From the moment it drew its first breath, it belonged to the state. And the state, in its relentless pursuit of military perfection, had no use for any child that was less than perfect. The first trial a Spartan faced was not on the battlefield, but in the first few hours of its life, and it was a trial of life or death. When a Spartan child was born, the father did not have the authority to decide whether to raise it. Instead, he was required by law to take the newborn infant and present it to a council of elders from his tribe. The location for this inspection, according to the historian Plutarch, was a place called the Lesh, a sort of public colonnade or meeting hall. Here, in the open air, a group of the most respected and senior men of the community would conduct a formal examination of the infant. This was not a cursory glance. They would turn the baby over, stretching its limbs, examining its tiny body from head to toe. They were looking for any sign of physical defect, any hint of weakness or deformity. Was the child well formed? Were its limbs straight and strong? Did it appear vigorous and healthy? Their criteria were stark and unforgiving, guided by a single, overriding principle. Would this child grow up to be a strong soldier or the mother of strong soldiers? The Spartan state was a machine designed to produce warriors, and it had no tolerance for any part that might prove to be faulty. It was the ultimate and most brutal form of state-sponsored eugenics. If the Council of Elders judged the infant to be well-built and sturdy, they would give the order for it to be raised. The father could then take his child home, but only after being assigned a kleros, one of the 9,000 lots of land, to ensure the child's sustenance. The child had been approved. It had been accepted as a future asset to the state. It had passed its first and most fundamental test, but if the council found the infant to be in any way ill-born or deformed, its fate was sealed. They would condemn it to death. The method of its disposal was as cold and impersonal as the judgment itself. The child was not returned to its parents. It was taken by a servant of the state to a deep chasm, a gorge at the foot of the towering Tekitis mountain range. This place was known as the Apothete, which translates grimly as the deposits, or the place of rejection. Here the unwanted infant was left, abandoned to die of exposure or from the attacks of wild animals. There was no ceremony, no burial, no mourning. The child was simply discarded, a defective product returned to the wilderness. Plutarch explains the chilling logic behind this practice. They held that it was better, both for the child itself and for the city, that it should not be raised if it did not have a good start in health and strength right from the very beginning. In the Spartan mindset, a life lived with a physical disability was a life not worth living, because such a life could not properly serve the state. a man who could not hold his place in the phalanx, a woman who might not bear healthy children. These were drains on the resources of the community, weaknesses that a society built on a knife's edge of fear could not afford. It was a philosophy of ruthless collective pragmatism, a complete subversion of the parental instinct in favor of the perceived needs of the state. The emotional impact of this practice on Spartan parents is something the ancient sources, written by men and for men, rarely touch upon. We are left to imagine the feelings of a father carrying his newborn child to the place of judgment, his heart caught between hope and terror. We can only guess at the silent agony of a mother waiting at home, knowing that the child she had, just brought into the world in pain and blood, could be condemned and taken from her forever by a committee of old men. Did they internalize this state-sponsored cruelty? Did they learn to suppress their own feelings of love and attachment, to see their children, as the state did, merely as assets or liabilities? Some modern scholars have questioned whether this practice of infant exposure was as systematic as Plutarch describes, suggesting it may have been exaggerated to emphasize Sparta's strangeness. Archaeological explorations of the chasm at the Apothecae have found human remains, but they are mostly those of adults, suggesting it may have been a place for executing criminals or traitors. However, the practice of infant exposure was common throughout the ancient Greek world, usually as a private decision made by the head of a household for economic reasons. What made the Spartan practice so unique and so shocking to other Greeks was that it was not a private decision. It was a mandatory, state-run, systematic policy. It was the first and most powerful lesson a Spartan learned: the state and not. Your parent has the ultimate power over your life and your death. This initial judgment at birth set the tone for everything that was to come. It was the first expression of a system that would systematically strip away individual identity and family bonds in favor of absolute loyalty and service to the collective. The child who survived the Apothecae had been granted its life by the state, and that life was now forfeit to the state's demands. It was a life that would be shaped, hardened, and brutalized by a system of education unlike any other in the ancient world. The child had been deemed fit enough to enter the machine. At the age of 7, the machine would come to claim it. The Agoge awaited. For a Spartan boy who had survived the judgment of the elders at birth, the first 7 years of his life were a brief and fleeting period of relative freedom. He would live at home, in the care of his mother and a Helot nurse. But this was merely a prelude, a short breath before the plunge into the all-consuming machinery of the Spartan state. For at the tender age of 7, his childhood would come to an abrupt and brutal end. He would be taken from his family, from the warmth and affection of his mother, and enrolled in the Agoge, the infamous Spartan state education system. This was not a school in any sense that we would recognize. It was a furnace, a crucible designed with a single, terrifying purpose: to systematically burn away the softness of childhood, to erase individuality, and to forge the boy into an unthinking, unfeeling, and utterly obedient weapon of the state. The word Agoge itself simply means the upbringing, but its methods were a world away from any normal conception of education. Upon entering the Agoge, the 7-year-old boy was immediately removed from his home. and forced to live in a communal barracks with other boys of his own age. This group, or herd, Agili, would be his new family. These were the boys with whom he would live, eat, train, and sleep for the next 13 years. The bonds he formed with this group, bonds of rivalry and solidarity, were deliberately intended to supplant his natural affection for his parents and siblings. His primary loyalty was no longer to his family, but to his herd and to the state. That commanded it. Life in the barracks was one of deliberate, calculated hardship. The boys were given only one garment to wear, a single rough cloak, or himation, which had to serve them through the heat of summer and the cold of winter. They were forced to sleep on hard beds made from reeds that they themselves had to gather from the banks of the Eurotas River, breaking them off with their bare hands without the use of a knife. They were forbidden from wearing sandals, their feet deliberately hardened by walking and running barefoot over the rocky Laconian terrain. Every comfort, every softness was stripped away. The goal was to make the boys tough, to make them impervious to pain, cold, and discomfort. The most notorious aspect of this early phase of the Agoge was the institutionalized policy of starvation. The boys were intentionally and systematically underfed. They were given rations that were just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. The ancient historian Xenophon, himself an admirer of the Spartan system, explained the logic behind this cruelty. He argued that it made the boys taller, as their bodies were not weighed down by excess food. He also claimed it made them more resourceful and daring, for there was a solution to their constant hunger. They were encouraged to steal. Theft was not considered a crime in the Agoge. In fact, it was a vital part of the curriculum. The boys were expected to supplement their meager rations by stealing food from the local farms, from the Helot storehouses, or even from the kitchens of the communal dining halls. But there was a critical rule. They must not get caught. A boy who successfully stole a cheese, a loaf of bread, or a piglet was praised for his cunning and his skill. But a boy who was caught in the act was severely punished. He was not punished for the act of stealing itself, but for his incompetence, for his lack of stealth, and his clumsiness. The punishment was a brutal flogging. This system was designed to teach the boys essential military skills: stealth, resourcefulness, cunning, and the ability to live off the land. It was training for the life of a soldier on campaign, or more chillingly, for the life of a member of the secret police, the Crypteia. Discipline within the Agoge was absolute and merciless. The boys were under the constant supervision of older youths and adult magistrates. Any sign of disobedience, any complaint, any emotional weakness was met with instant and severe physical punishment. Flogging was a daily occurrence, an essential tool for instilling obedience and suppressing any spark of individualism. The boys were taught to endure pain without flinching, to accept punishment without question. They were even encouraged to fight amongst themselves, their supervisors deliberately instilling rivalries to foster a spirit of aggression and to identify the strongest and most dominant boys in the herd. The formal education was minimal. Unlike in Athens, where boys studied rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, the Spartan curriculum was almost entirely focused on practical and military matters. The boys learned to read and write, but only enough for basic military dispatches. There, Education was primarily in athletics, running, jumping, wrestling, and throwing the javelin and discus. And in music and dance, this might seem surprising, but Spartan music was not for entertainment. It was martial music with strong, simple rhythms used to drill the boys in moving together as a group. Their dances were not expressions of joy, but war dances like the Pirish, which simulated the movements of combat attacking, defending, and dodging blows. Everything was designed to teach them to operate as a single, unified entity, the phalanx. Their intellectual training was focused on developing what became known as laconic speech, named after their homeland of Laconia. They were taught to speak only when necessary, and to express themselves in short, pithy, and often biting statements. Long-winded or philosophical speech was seen as a sign of weakness and self-indulgence. They were constantly questioned by their elders on matters of civic virtue and military tactics, and they were expected to give a clever and concise answer instantly. A boy who hesitated or gave a foolish answer would be punished, sometimes by having his thumb bitten by the magistrate. This was mental training designed to create a mind that was quick, decisive, and focused only on the essential dot. From the age of 7 to 12, the Spartan boy was systematically broken down. His connection to his family was severed. His sense of individual identity was subsumed into the group. His body was hardened by cold, hunger, and pain. His mind was disciplined to be sharp and unquestioning. He learned to be tough, to be cunning, to be obedient, and to be utterly ruthless. He was no longer a child. He was a weapon in the early stages of its forging. The state had laid its foundation of hardship and fear. Now, as he entered his teenage years, the heat of the forge would be turned up, and the process of hardening the steel would begin in earnest. If the first stage of the Agoge was about breaking the child, the second stage was about reforging the adolescent into a hardened instrument of war. As the Spartan boy entered his teenage years from the age of roughly 13 until he turned 20, the pressures, the hardships, and the institutionalized brutality of his upbringing intensified dramatically. This was the period when the boy was transformed into a young man. His training focused with terrifying single-mindedness on the skills of combat, the endurance of unimaginable pain, and the complete psychological submission to the Spartan ideal. The furnace of the Agoge was now at its hottest, and the steel of the future Spartan Hoplite was about to be tempered. The physical training, which had been constant since the age of 7, now became the all-consuming center of the boy's existence. The athletics, the running, the wrestling, the javelin throwing were no longer mere exercises. They were relentless preparations for the battlefield. The wrestling matches became more violent, aimed at incapacitating an opponent. The war dances became more complex and physically demanding. The boys' lives became a grueling, endless cycle of physical exertion designed to push their bodies to the absolute limits of their capabilities and beyond. The goal was to create a soldier who was not just strong, but also possessed an almost superhuman level of stamina and resilience. During this period, the social structure of the Agoges also became more complex and more fraught with peril. The older boys, those in their late teens, were given direct authority over the younger ones. They were expected to act as disciplinarians and role models, and they were encouraged to be harsh and demanding. This created a rigid hierarchy within. The barracks, a system where a boy learned to both command and obey, to dish out punishment, and to receive it. It was a microcosm of the military chain of command he would inhabit for the rest of his life. This hierarchy was also intertwined with one of the most controversial aspects of Spartan society: institutionalized pederasty. It was common, and indeed expected, for an older boy or a young adult warrior to select a younger adolescent in the Agoge as his protege. This relationship was not primarily sexual in the modern sense, though an erotic element was certainly present. It was a mentorship. The older partner, the erased or lover, was responsible for the younger boys, the aids or hearer's moral and military development. He was expected to train him, to guide him, and to serve as his model of Spartan virtue. The relationship was a powerful tool for transmitting the values of the state from one generation to the next. However, this bond came with a heavy burden of responsibility. The honor and reputation of the older partner were directly tied to the conduct of the younger boy. If the younger boy showed cowardice or weakness, it was the older partner who was shamed and often punished for having failed in his educational duty. This system created intense emotional bonds between the boys and men, a powerful camaraderie that would later be invaluable on the battlefield, where men in the phalanx depended on each other for their very lives. But it was also a system ripe for abuse, one that further blurred the lines between education, discipline, and violence. But the violence of the Agoge was not just a matter of punishment. It was a core part of the curriculum. The boys were encouraged, and at times required, to fight one another in brutal, bare-knuckle brawls. These fights were not for sport. They were to test a boy's courage and his ability to withstand pain. Plutarch tells of a ritual where two groups of boys would be placed on opposite sides of a ditch and ordered to fight until one group had driven the other back, using their fists, feet, and even biting and gouging. This was training in pure, animalistic aggression, the ultimate expression of this philosophy of pain and endurance. Was the annual ritual held at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Artemis was an ancient pre-Dorian goddess of the wild, and her cult in Sparta was famously brutal. Each year, a group of adolescent boys from the Agoge was selected to participate in a contest of endurance. They were brought to the altar of the goddess and subjected to a relentless, ritualized flogging with long, cruel whips. This was not a symbolic act. It was a genuine and life-threatening ordeal. The boys' backs were flayed open, the blood streaming down onto the altar. The goal of the contest was not to see who would cry out first, but simply who could endure the longest without collapsing or dying. The ancient writer Pausanias, visiting Sparta in Roman times when the ritual had become a tourist spectacle, described it in chilling detail. The boys are flogged at the altar, ... and I have seen many of them die under the blows. The priestess of the goddess would stand by, holding the wooden statue of Artemis, and if the floggers seemed to be holding back out of pity for a boy, she would cry out that the statue was growing too heavy, urging them to strike harder. A boy who survived this ordeal, and especially one who endured it without a sound, won immense honor and prestige for himself and his family. He had proven his Spartan manhood in the most extreme way possible. The ritual was a brutal rite of passage, a public demonstration of the core Spartan value, the ability to endure any amount of pain for the sake of honor and the state. It was a psychological conditioning tool of immense power, designed to create a man who did not fear pain, and therefore did not fear death. By the time a young Spartan reached the age of 20, the process of forging was nearly complete. He had endured 13 years of systematic deprivation, brutalization, and psychological conditioning. He knew nothing but the life of the barracks, the authority of the state, and the company of his fellow soldiers. He had been taught that emotion was weakness, that individuality was a crime, and that the highest good was to die for Sparta. He was now a fully trained soldier, a perfect instrument of war. But there was one final, shadowy test to complete his education, a graduation exercise that would take him beyond the barracks and into the dark heart of the Spartan system of control. He was now ready for the Crypteia, the secret war against the Helots. At the culmination of the Agoge, after years of relentless training and brutalization, the most promising young Spartans were selected for a final, terrifying rite of passage. This was not a public ceremony or a test of strength in the gymnasium. It was a descent into a world of shadow and fear, a secret mission that embodied the dark, paranoid heart of the Spartan state. This institution was the Crypteia, a word that can be translated as the secret service or the hiding. It was the ultimate expression of Sparta's permanent, undeclared war against its own enslaved population, and it served as the bloody graduation of its future leaders. The Crypteia remains one of the most mysterious and debated aspects of Spartan society. The ancient sources speak of it in hushed tones, befitting its clandestine nature. The Greek philosopher Plato refers to it as a form of endurance training. Plutarch, writing centuries later, gives us the most detailed and chilling account, portraying it as a state-sanctioned death squad. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, but the picture that emerges is one of a uniquely Spartan institution, a perfect fusion of military training, internal policing, and psychological warfare. The selection process for the Crypteia was likely rigorous. The ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who held immense power in Sparta, would choose the young men who had shown the most intelligence, cunning, and, above all, ruthlessness during their time in the Agoge. These were not the brawlers or the simple athletes. These were the sharpest knives in the drawer, the ones destined for leadership. Their mission was a lonely and terrifying one. They were to be sent out from the city, away from the structured life of the barracks, to live in the countryside by themselves. They were given only the most basic equipment, a single dagger, and perhaps a small amount of food to start. Their instructions were stark. They were to hide during the daylight hours, sleeping in the hills and forests, avoiding all contact. They were to become like ghosts, invisible observers of the world around them. Then, under the cover of darkness, they were to descend from their hiding places and move silently through the lands farmed by the Helots. Their primary mission was to live off the land, to survive by their wits, stealing food and finding shelter. This was, in itself, an advanced form of the survival training they had received as young boys in the Agoge. It was the ultimate test of their self-reliance and resourcefulness. But the Crypteia had a second, far more sinister purpose. It was not just about survival. It was about control. As these young Spartans moved through the Helot villages at night, They were acting as an undercover intelligence service. They were spying on the Helot population, listening for any whispers of dissent, any signs of unrest. They were identifying the natural leaders within the Helot communities, the strongest, the most intelligent, the most defiant individuals. These were the Helots who might one day have the charisma and courage to organize a revolt, and once these individuals were identified, the second part of the mission would begin. The young Spartan, acting alone and in secret, was to assassinate them, as Plutarch grimly relates. By night they came down and murdered any Helot they caught. This was not random violence. It was targeted political assassination. It was a systematic policy of culling the strong from the Helot population, a preemptive strike against any potential rebellion before it could even begin. It was a brutal, but from the Spartan perspective, entirely logical extension of the annual declaration of war on the Helots. It transformed a legal fiction into a deadly reality for any Helot who dared to stand a little too tall. Imagine the psychological impact of this, both on the perpetrators and the victims. For the young Spartan, it was the ultimate test of his indoctrination. He was alone, far from the support of his comrades, and tasked with killing in cold blood. Not in the heat of battle against an armed enemy, but in the dead of night against an unarmed farmer or laborer. It was an act designed to completely sever any lingering sense of shared Greek identity or human empathy he might have felt for the Helots. It taught him to be a ruthless agent of the state, to see the Helots not as people, but as a dangerous threat to be managed, and when necessary, eliminated. It was the final, brutal lesson in what it meant to be a Spartan ruler. For the Helot population, the Crypteia was an instrument of pure terror. It created an atmosphere of constant, suffocating paranoia. Anyone could be a spy. Any neighbor could be an informer. The darkness, which should have brought rest from a long day of labor, instead brought a new kind of fear. A Helot father who spoke too freely of his hatred for the masters. A strong young man who refused to be humiliated. These individuals would simply disappear in the night. There would be no investigation, no justice. Their families would be left to wonder and to fear. The Crypteia ensured that the Helots remained a disorganized, terrified, and leaderless population, constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid of the shadows. This secret war had a profound effect on the Spartan character. It fostered a culture of secrecy, suspicion, and conspiracy. The Spartans became masters of deception, not just against the Helots, but in their dealings with other Greek states as well. They were known for their duplicity, their laconic speech often used to hide their true intentions. The Crypteia was a training ground for this mindset. It taught them to live a double life, to present a disciplined face to the world, while engaging in acts of brutal subterfuge. The Crypteia was the dark heart of the Agoge, the point where the Spartan system of education and its system of internal control became one and the same. It was the final, horrific step in the process of creating the perfect Spartan citizen, a young man who passed through the crucible of the Crypteia had proven that he was self-reliant, cunning, obedient, and utterly ruthless. He had proven his willingness to kill for the state, not in the glory of open battle, but in the silence of a midnight execution. He was now fully initiated into the brutal realities of Spartan power. He was ready to take his place as a full citizen, a master, and a guardian of the terrified foundation upon which his entire world was built. In the rigidly patriarchal world of ancient Greece, women were, for the most part, invisible. In Athens, a respectable woman's life was one of domestic seclusion, confined to the private quarters of her own home, with no public role and little to no education. It is in this context that the women of Sparta present us with one of the most startling paradoxes of the ancient world. Spartan women were famous and often infamous throughout Greece for their freedom, their education, their outspokenness, and their influence. They were athletes who exercised in public, landowners who managed vast estates, and sharp-tongued matriarchs who were said to rule their men. Yet this apparent freedom was not the product of an enlightened or liberal philosophy. It was just as calculated, and in its own way just as brutal, as the upbringing of the men. The Spartan woman was free only because her freedom served the ultimate purpose of the state, the breeding of perfect warriors. From birth, the life of a Spartan girl was radically different from that of her counterpart in any other Greek city. Like her brother, she was first and foremost the property of the state. It is believed that female infants were also inspected by the council of elders, and those deemed weak or deformed were likely left at the apotheke to die. A girl who was allowed to live was not raised to be a demure and silent housekeeper. She was raised to be a strong, healthy, and robust mother of future soldiers. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel for the production of the state's next generation of defenders. To this end, Spartan girls, unlike other Greek girls, received a formal state-sponsored education. This education was not focused on weaving or domestic skills, which were considered the work of Helot women. Instead, it was centered on physical fitness. The girls participated in a rigorous program of athletics, training alongside the boys in many cases, though separately. They learned to run, to wrestle, to throw the discus and the javelin. They competed in public athletic contests, often exercising in short tunics that scandalized other Greeks, who were accustomed to their own women being hidden away. The purpose of this physical education was starkly eugenic. The Spartans believed that strong, athletic parents would produce strong, athletic children. A healthy body was a prerequisite for a healthy womb. Their academic and cultural education was also tailored to the needs of the state. They learned to read and write so that they could manage the large agricultural estates, the kleroi, that they would one day control. With their husbands away for most of their lives, first in the Agoge, then in the barracks, and then on military campaigns, it was the women who were the day-to-day managers of Sparta's economic foundation. They were expected to be competent and hard-headed administrators, overseeing the Helot workforce and ensuring that the estate produced the required surplus to support their husbands' mess contributions. This economic power gave Spartan women a degree of independence and influence that was unparalleled in Greece. They were also educated in music, dance, and poetry. They participated in choral performances at religious festivals, their songs and dances designed to instill the values of courage, honor, and sacrifice. The poetry they learned was not about romantic love, but about the glory of dying for Sparta. The role of the woman was to be the primary guardian and transmitter of the Spartan martial ethos. It was in her role as a wife and mother that the Spartan woman's unique function became clearest. Marriage in Sparta was a strange affair. A young man was expected to marry around the age of 20, but he would continue to live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers until he was 30. Marriage was therefore a clandestine business. A young husband would have to sneak out of his barracks at night, visit his wife in secret, and then return before dawn, hoping not to be caught by his comrades. The purpose of this, according to Plutarch, was to maintain the men's focus on their military duties, and to ensure that when the couple did meet, their passions were high, which was thought to produce more vigorous offspring. Children born from these unions were raised by their mothers for the first 7 years, but even then, the mother's role was to begin the process of toughening the child, preparing him for his inevitable entry into the Agoge. The Spartan mother was famously or infamously devoid of the maternal sentimentality prized in other cultures. She was taught that her sons belonged not to her, but to Sparta. Her duty was not to coddle them, but to make them brave. The stories of their stoicism are legendary. It was said that a Spartan mother, upon hearing that her son had died in battle, would not weep, but would ask first whether he had died honorably, facing the enemy. If the answer was yes, she would go to the temple to give thanks to the gods. If the answer was no, that he had died a coward, she would mourn not his death, but his disgrace. The most famous Spartan saying attributed to a mother handing her son his shield as he went off to war is with this or on this. Come back either carrying your shield in victory or being carried upon it, dead. There was no third option. Surrender was unthinkable. This role, as the enforcer of courage, gave Spartan women immense social power. They were the arbiters of a man's reputation. It was the praise of women that a Spartan man sought, and it was their scorn that he feared most. A man who returned from battle in disgrace, a trembler who had shown cowardice, would face a life of unbearable public humiliation, not just from his male peers, but from all the women of the community. They would refuse to speak to him. His own mother and sisters would shun him. This social pressure was one of the most powerful weapons in the Spartan arsenal, ensuring that every man would rather die on the battlefield than face the shame of returning home a coward. This unique position educated, athletic, economically powerful, and socially influential made Spartan women a source of endless fascination and horror to other Greeks. Aristotle, the Athenian philosopher, was deeply critical of them. He blamed Sparta's decline on the fact that the men were ruled by their women and that their control of property gave them too much power and led to a culture of luxury. He failed to grasp that the freedom of Spartan women was not a contradiction of the Spartan system, but its necessary component. The Spartan woman was not free for her own sake. She was free to run so she could bear strong sons. She was free to own land so her husband could be free to be a soldier. She was free to speak her mind so she could shame cowards and praise heroes. She was a crucial and powerful cog in the great, terrible machine of the Spartan state, a breeder and guardian of the warrior ethos, a woman whose entire life was a testament to the brutal, pragmatic, and all-consuming logic of her city. When a Spartan male turned 20, he graduated from the Agoge. He was now a fully trained soldier, a warrior forged in the crucible of pain and discipline. But he was not yet a full citizen. To achieve that status, to become one of the elite, the homoioi, or equals, he had to clear one final crucial hurdle. He had to be accepted into a Syssitia, one of the communal dining messes that formed the very heart of Spartan civic and military life. The Syssitia was far more than just a cafeteria. It was a private club, a military unit, a political forum, and a lifelong test of a man's character and standing. Failure to gain entry or to maintain one's place within it meant ruin, the loss of citizenship, and a life of public disgrace. The institution of the Syssitia was ancient, attributed, like most Spartan laws, to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. Its purpose was central to the Spartan ethos. By forcing all male citizens to eat their main meal together every single day, it fostered a spirit of camaraderie, equality, and social control. It was a physical manifestation of the ideal that every Spartan was a brother in arms, his life inextricably bound to his comrades. From the age of 20 until he was 60 and released from military service, a Spartan man's primary household was not the one he shared with his wife, but the one he shared with the 15 or so men of his dining mess. Gaining entry was a formal and nerve-wracking process. A young man would be nominated for membership in a specific mess, often the one his father belonged to. The existing members of the mess would then vote on his admission in a secret ballot. The procedure was simple and brutally effective. Each member would take a small piece of bread, a crumb, and drop it into a vessel carried around by a servant. If the member approved of the candidate, he would simply drop the crumb in as it was. If he disapproved, he would squeeze it flat in his hand before dropping it in. According to Plutarch, a single flattened crumb, a single no vote, was enough to deny the candidate admission. The requirement for unanimous consent meant that a young man had to have a flawless reputation and no personal enemies within the group he hoped to join. Once accepted, the man became a full member for life, provided he could meet the obligations. The most important of these was the monthly contribution of provisions. The Syssitia was not funded by the state. Each member was required to contribute a set amount of food and drink from the produce of his own hereditary estate, his kleros. The typical monthly share was a bushel of barley, 8 gallons of wine, 5 pounds of cheese, 2.5 pounds of figs, and a small amount of money to buy meat or fish. This was not a small amount. It required a well-managed estate and a productive Helot workforce. This contribution was the economic linchpin of the entire Spartan system of citizenship. If a man, through poor management, a bad harvest, or the loss of his estate, was unable to make his monthly contribution, he was immediately and automatically stripped of his citizenship. He would be expelled from the mess and relegated to a lower social class, known as the inferiors. This system ensured that only those with productive land could be citizens, and it placed a relentless pressure on every Spartan to manage his estate effectively, a task largely carried out by his wife. The fear of losing one's citizenship was a powerful motivator, second only to the fear of being branded a coward. The atmosphere within the Syssitia was a mixture of military camaraderie and intense social scrutiny. The food itself was famously plain and unappetizing. The most notorious dish was a black broth, a pork-based soup whose other ingredients could only be guessed at. A story was told of a visitor from Sybaris, a city famous for its luxury, who, after tasting the broth, remarked, "Now I know why the Spartans do not fear death." The simplicity of the food was deliberate, designed to promote discipline and to prevent the rise of luxury. The dining hall was a place of constant testing and education. The men would recline on hard wooden benches, their conversation strictly controlled. An older member of the mess would point to the door and remind the younger men, "Through that door, no word goes out." It was a lesson in secrecy and the importance of discretion. The conversation was often a form of oral examination. The older men would pose questions to the younger men about military tactics, civic affairs, or the reputations of their fellow citizens. They would ask, "Who is the best man in the city?" Or, "What do you think of this action?" The young man was expected to give a clever, laconic answer, and his response would be judged by the whole table. A foolish or ill-considered remark would be met with silence or scorn. It was also a place for humor, but of a particular, biting, Spartan kind. The men were encouraged to make witty and sarcastic jokes at each other's expense, but never in a way that was considered vulgar or abusive. The ability to both deliver and receive a sharp-witted jibe without losing one's composure was considered a key part of the Spartan character. It was a way of toughening the spirit, just as the Agoge had toughened the body. The Syssitia also served as the primary social unit within the Spartan army. The men who ate together fought together. The bonds of loyalty and friendship forged over years of shared meals and conversation were translated directly onto the battlefield. A man in the phalanx was standing shoulder to shoulder with the members of his mess, his brothers. He would not dare to show cowardice in front of them, and he would fight to the death to protect them. The dining hall was the crucible where the social glue of the Spartan phalanx was hardened. The Syssitia was the great equalizer and the great enforcer of the Spartan way of life. Within its walls, all men were supposedly equal, eating the same simple food and subject to the same strict discipline. It prevented the accumulation of private wealth and the pursuit of luxury. It bound the Spartan male into a tight-knit brotherhood, a pack whose collective strength was far greater than the sum of its parts. But it was a fragile equality, one that depended on a man's ability to pay his dues. To be a Spartan was to be in a constant state of performance, a lifelong trial where the judges were the men who sat beside you at your evening meal. The popular image of Sparta, both in ancient times and today, is one of stark, unyielding austerity. We imagine a society that was deliberately artless, a cultural desert where the only beauty to be found was in the grim perfection of the phalanx. We are told that the Spartans despised luxury, scorned philosophy, and had no time for the poetry, sculpture, and fine pottery that flourished in other Greek cities. They were warriors, not artists. This image of a people who sacrificed all forms of cultural expression for the sake of military discipline is a powerful part of the Spartan myth. But like so much of the myth, it is both a simplification and a distortion. It is a snapshot taken at one particular moment in their history, which ignores a richer, more complex past and mistakes a deliberate political choice for an innate characteristic. The truth is that Sparta was not born without art. It was a society that chose to strangle its own artistic impulses. If we could travel back, not to the Sparta of the Persian Wars in the 5th century BC, but to the Sparta of the Archaic period. In the 7th and 6th centuries BC, we would find a very different world. In this earlier era, before the fear of the Helots had completely consumed their society and fossilized their culture, Sparta was one of the leading artistic and cultural centers of the Greek world. The archaeological record tells a story of a city that was vibrant, creative, and engaged with the wider currents of Greek civilization. Excavations at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, the very place where the brutal flogging ritual would later take place, have unearthed thousands of exquisite votive offerings from this period. And these are not the crude trinkets of a primitive people. They are beautifully carved ivory figurines, intricate lead statuettes, and fine terracotta masks that show a high degree of artistic skill and imagination. They depict animals, mythological scenes, and grotesque, demonic faces, all rendered with a verve and creativity that rivals the products of any other Greek state of the time. In this earlier period, Sparta was also famous for its fine pottery. Laconian painted ware from the 6th century BC was a highly prized export item, found in archaeological sites all across the Mediterranean, from Italy to Egypt. The painters who decorated these cups and vases were masters of their craft. The most famous of them, known simply as the Hunt Painter, created complex and lively narrative scenes filled with mythological subjects, images of daily life and scenes of warfare and hunting. This was the work of a confident and outward-looking culture, a society that valued beauty and craftsmanship. Perhaps most surprisingly, archaic Sparta was a renowned center for music and poetry. It was not the grim, martial music of the later Agoge, but a sophisticated lyrical tradition. The Spartans actively imported the most famous poets and musicians of the day to live and work in their city. Terpander of Lesbos, a celebrated musician, was said to have come to Sparta to quell civil strife with his beautiful songs. The great choral lyric poet Alcman, active in the 7th century BC, wrote complex and beautiful hymns for choirs of Spartan girls to perform at religious festivals. His surviving fragments speak not of war and death, but of nature, of love, and of the beauty of the young women in his choir. This was a Sparta that sang, a Sparta that celebrated beauty, a Sparta that was in many ways a normal and thriving Greek polis. So, what happened? Why did this vibrant artistic culture wither and die? The answer lies in the deep trauma of the Messenian Wars and the constant gnawing fear of the Helots. Sometime in the mid-6th century BC, the Spartan leadership appears to have made a conscious and radical decision. They concluded that to maintain their precarious control over their enslaved population, they could no longer afford the luxuries of art and high culture. These things were distractions. They encouraged individualism, softness, and foreign ideas, all of which were a threat to the absolute unity and discipline required to maintain their military state. And so, the doors began to close. Foreign poets were no longer welcome. The production of fine painted pottery ceased, replaced by simple, undecorated wares for domestic use. The creation of elaborate bronze and ivory sculptures dwindled. The very definition of a Spartan citizen was narrowed to exclude anyone who was not a full-time soldier. The state began to actively suppress cultural expression and enforce a rigid, monolithic, and austere way of life. It was a deliberate act of cultural self-mutilation, all for the sake of security, that the Spartans themselves were masters of propaganda, and they actively promoted this new image of themselves as a uniquely austere and disciplined people, superior to the soft, money-grubbing, and decadent citizens of other states. They created what we might call the Spartan Mirage. They wanted other Greeks to see them as a people who were different, harder, more virtuous. And other Greeks, particularly philosophers like Plato and Xenophon, were often eager to believe it, dissatisfied with the perceived chaos of their own. Democracies, they looked to Sparta and saw an ideal of order, stability, and selfless devotion to the state. They praised Sparta for its rejection of luxury and its focus on martial virtue, often taking the Spartan self-image at face value. But this austerity was, in many ways, a sham. While the Spartan state promoted a public image of equality and simplicity, the reality was that great inequalities of wealth existed. Powerful families had vast estates and access to resources far beyond that of a simple Spartiate. While they could not openly flaunt their wealth in the city, they could spend it on raising prize-winning chariot teams for the Olympic Games, a hugely expensive and prestigious undertaking. The Spartan obsession with victory at the Olympics reveals a deep-seated vanity and competitiveness that belies their image of humble self-sacrifice. Furthermore, in the later stages of their history, Spartan commanders on campaign abroad became notorious for their susceptibility to bribery and their love of luxury, suggesting that their famous austerity was perhaps only skin-deep, a discipline enforced by the constant surveillance of their peers at home. The story of Spartan art is therefore a tragedy. It is the story of a culture that chose to abandon its own creative potential out of fear. The beautiful ivories from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia are a poignant reminder of a different path that Sparta could have taken, a Sparta that might have been remembered not just for its warriors, but for its artists and poets as well. But in the stark calculus of Spartan survival, there was no room for such things. To forge the perfect weapon, the state believed it first had to kill the artist within. The result was a society of unmatched military prowess, but one that left the world with very little of lasting beauty, only a powerful and enduring myth of its own grim perfection. All the brutal training of the Agoge, all the terror of the Crypteia, all the social pressure of the Syssitia, it all led to this, the final product, the reason for the existence of the entire Spartan state, the Spartan Hoplite. For centuries, this figure dominated the battlefields of ancient Greece. He was the most feared, most respected, and most professional soldier of his age. When a Spartan army marched to war, with their long hair, their scarlet cloaks, and the rhythmic chant of their paean, even the bravest of their enemies felt a chill of fear. But the true strength of the Spartan hoplite lay not in individual heroism or superhuman skill, as the myths would have us believe. His strength lay in the fact that he was not an individual at all. He was a perfect, interchangeable cog in a disciplined, terrifying, and merciless machine, the Spartan phalanx. The equipment of the Spartan hoplite was, for the most part, standard for a heavy infantryman of the period, though of the highest quality. His primary defensive weapon was his shield, the aspis. This was a large, concave, circular shield, about 3 feet in diameter, made of wood and covered, in a thin layer of bronze. It was heavy, weighing around 15 pounds, and was held by a central strap for the forearm, the porpax, and a grip at the rim for the hand, the antilabe. This design meant that the shield protected not only its bearer's left side, but also extended to cover the right side of the man standing next to him. This was the essential technology of the phalanx, a weapon that was as much communal as it was personal. The Spartan shield was famously marked with the Greek letter lambda, for Laconia, their homeland, a symbol that was instantly recognizable and deeply intimidating. To lose one's shield in battle was the ultimate disgrace, as it meant a soldier had not only failed to protect himself, but had endangered his comrades by creating a gap in the wall. For armor, the Spartan wore a bronze helmet, often of the Corinthian style in the earlier periods, which covered the entire head and face, leaving only slits for the eyes and mouth. He wore bronze greaves to protect his shins. The iconic image of the bare-chested Spartan warrior is largely a product of Hollywood. While some may have fought this way to display their physical prowess, most would have worn a cuirass for body armor, either a bell cuirass made of bronze, or more commonly, a linothorax, a composite armor made from layers of linen glued together to form a tough, light, and flexible defense. Over this he would wear his famous scarlet cloak, the phoenicus. This cloak was not worn in battle, but on the march. Its purpose, according to Spartan sources, was twofold. It was a color least like that of a woman, and its bright red color would help to conceal the sight of blood, both his own and his enemies, preventing panic in the ranks, the Spartans. Primary offensive weapon was his spear, the dory. This was a long, heavy spear, typically 7 to 9 feet in length, with a sharp iron spearhead and a bronze butt spike called a sorter, or lizard killer. The butt spike could be used to finish off fallen enemies or to plant the spear in the ground. The spear was used for thrusting, not throwing, and was wielded overhand in the front ranks of the phalanx. For close quarters combat, if his spear was broken, the hoplite carried a short sword, the xiphos. This was a secondary weapon, a last resort for the brutal, shoving melee that would occur after the spear points had done their work. But it was not the equipment that made the Spartan soldier so formidable. It was his lifelong training in using this equipment as part of a single cohesive unit. The Spartan phalanx was typically 8 to 12 ranks deep. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to form a solid wall of bronze and wood. From this wall, a forest of spear points projected, presenting a terrifying and almost impenetrable front to the enemy. The key to the phalanx's success was discipline and cohesion. Every man had to hold his ground. A single man faltering or breaking rank could create a fatal gap in the line. This is where the Agoge proved its worth. The endless drills, the martial music, the choral dances, it all came down to this. The Spartan soldiers could move with a precision and unity that other Greek armies, made up of citizen militias, could only dream of. They could advance at a steady, disciplined pace, their steps timed to the rhythm of a flute, their morale bolstered by the singing of a war hymn. They could execute complex maneuvers on the battlefield, wheeling or changing formation, without losing their cohesion. They were, in essence, a professional army in an age of amateurs. The psychology of the Spartan hoplite was his greatest weapon. He had been trained from birth to suppress his own fear and his instinct for self-preservation. His entire value system was built around the honor of the group and the glory of dying for the state. He was not fighting for himself. He was fighting for the man next to him, the men in his mess, and the city that had made him. This created a level of morale and battlefield discipline that was terrifying to behold. When a Spartan phalanx charged, it did not stop. It did not break. It was a relentless, grinding wall of death. The battle itself was a brutal and visceral affair. The two opposing phalanxes would advance on each other, and the clash, the athismos, or shoving, was a moment of terrifying violence. The front ranks would meet with a horrific crash of shield on shield, spear on bronze. The goal was to literally push the enemy phalanx backwards to break its formation. The men in the rear ranks would push on the men in front of them, adding their weight to the shove while stabbing at the enemy over the shoulders of their comrades. It was a suffocating, terrifying scrum, a contest of sheer physical strength and unwavering nerve. It was in this brutal moment that the Spartans' superior discipline and professionalism paid off. While other armies might break and flee under the immense pressure, the Spartans would hold their ground. Their lifetime of training, their bonds with their comrades, and their absolute terror of disgrace made them immovable. Once the enemy line began to waver, the Spartans would press their advantage relentlessly, the disciplined shove turning into a slaughter as they broke through the enemy formation and their short swords got to work. The Spartan hoplite was the ultimate product of his society. He was brave, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. But he was not a hero in the individualistic sense. He was a cog, a perfectly crafted and utterly replaceable part in a great machine. His individual thoughts, his fears, his hopes, all were subordinate to the function of the machine. The state had stripped him of his humanity in order to make him the perfect soldier. This made him the master of the battlefield for generations, but it also represented the profound and terrible tragedy of his existence. He was a weapon and nothing more. In the tumultuous world of ancient Greek politics, where cities experimented with radical democracy, iron-fisted tyranny, and chaotic oligarchy, Sparta stood apart. Its system of government was a strange and complex relic, a bizarre mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and a limited form of democracy that utterly bewildered other Greeks. It was a system designed not for progress, innovation, or the expression of the popular will, but for its exact opposite, perfect, unchanging stability. The entire political apparatus of Sparta was a deeply conservative machine, engineered with a single purpose in mind to prevent any change that might upset the delicate and brutal balance of power that kept the Helots enslaved and the Spartiates in control. At the top of this strange structure were not one, but two kings. This dual kingship was unique in the Greek world. The two kings always came from two specific hereditary families, the Agiades and the Eurypontids, who both claimed direct descent from the mythical hero Heracles. The reasons for this dual system were lost to time, but it served a practical purpose. It prevented any single man from accumulating too much power and becoming a tyrant. The two kings were often rivals, their families jealous of one another, and this internal check on their power was a key feature of the Spartan system. The powers of the kings were significant, but strictly limited. Their primary role was as military commanders. One of the two kings would lead the Spartan army on campaign, while the other remained at home. In the field, the king held absolute authority, with the power of life and death over his soldiers. But the moment he returned to Sparta, he was just another citizen, subject to the laws and the authority of the other governing bodies. The kings also held important religious duties, acting as the chief priests of the state and as intermediaries between the city and the gods. They had some judicial functions, particularly concerning adoptions and the marriage of heiresses. But in terms of domestic policy, their power was surprisingly weak. They were not absolute monarchs, but hereditary generals and high priests. The true center of power in Sparta lay not with the kings, but with the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. This was the supreme political and judicial body of the state. It was composed of 28 men plus the two kings for a total of 30 members. To be a member of the Gerousia was the highest honor a Spartan man could achieve. The qualifications were simple. A man had to be over the age of 60 and thus released from military service, and he had to have a reputation for impeccable virtue and lifelong service to the state. When a member of the Gerousia died, a new one was elected by the popular assembly in a peculiar and ancient ritual. The candidates would walk in turn before the assembled citizens, and the crowd would shout and roar for the man they favored. In a nearby building, a group of judges would sit, unable to see the candidates, and would simply judge who had received the loudest and most sustained applause. The Gerousia held tremendous power. It prepared all the legislation that was to be presented to the popular assembly, effectively controlling the entire political agenda. It also served as the highest court in the land, with the authority to try the most serious criminal cases, including those involving murder, treason, and even the conduct of the kings themselves. With its members serving for life, the Gerousia was a deeply conservative institution. It was a council of old men, steeped in the traditions of the Spartan system, whose primary goal was to preserve that system exactly as it was. They were the brakes on the Spartan state, designed to resist any new or radical ideas. Alongside the kings and the Gerousia was a third body, the ephors. The board of 5 ephors were elected annually from the general citizen population. In theory, they were supposed to represent the will of the people, but in practice, they became the most powerful and often the most tyrannical political force in Sparta. Their powers were vast and vaguely defined. They presided over the meetings of the Gerousia and the popular assembly. They were responsible for the day-to-day administration of the state and for the conduct of foreign policy, receiving ambassadors and dispatching envoys. They held supreme authority over the Agoge, the state education system, and it was they who annually declared war on the Helots and dispatched the Crypteia. Ephors also served as a powerful check on the power of the kings. 2 ephors would accompany a king on military campaign, not as soldiers, but as political minders, there to observe his conduct and report back to Sparta. They had the power to arrest and imprison the kings, and to bring them to trial before the Gerousia. This constant surveillance and the threat of prosecution ensured that even the most successful general remained subservient to the authority of the state. The ephors, with their short term of office and their sweeping powers, often represented the most radical and ruthless element of the Spartan government. But their radicalism was always in the service of maintaining the established order through whatever means necessary. And what of the common Spartan citizen? His political voice was expressed through the appella, the popular assembly. All male citizens over the age of 30 were eligible to attend the meetings of the appella. Here they would listen to the proposals brought forth by the Gerousia and vote on them. But this was not a democracy in the Athenian sense. There was no freedom of debate. A normal citizen could not stand up and propose a law or make a speech. He could only listen to the proposals of the elders and vote yes or no. The method of voting was as primitive as the election for the Gerousia. The men would simply shout their approval or disapproval, and the presiding official would judge the outcome by the volume of the noise. It was a system designed for acclamation, not for deliberation. The role of the assembly was simply to ratify the decisions of their elders. This entire complex and interlocking system of kings, elders, and magistrates was a masterpiece of conservative design. Every part of the government was checked and balanced. By another part, creating a political gridlock that made change almost impossible. The kings were checked by the ephors. The ephors, with their short term, were checked by the lifelong power of the Gerousia, and the Gerousia's proposals could, in theory, be rejected by the assembly. The result was a state that was incredibly stable, but also completely inflexible. It was a political fossil, deliberately designed to perpetuate itself without alteration. For centuries, this system succeeded in its goal. It maintained the iron grip of the Spartiates over the Helots and preserved the Spartan way of life. But in the long run, this very inflexibility, this inability to adapt to a changing world, would prove to be Sparta's fatal flaw. For 2 centuries, from the Persian Wars to its climactic victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, the Spartan system worked. It produced the most feared army in the Greek world and made Sparta the dominant power in Greece. The city seemed to be the very model of stability and order, an unbreachable fortress of tradition in a world of constant change. But the very system that gave Sparta its strength was also a slow-acting poison. The rigid discipline, the brutal eugenics, the economic straitjacket of the Kleros system, and the absolute resistance to change, these were the seeds of an inevitable and catastrophic decline. The story of Sparta's fall is the story of a society so perfectly adapted to one specific set of circumstances that it was utterly incapable of surviving when those circumstances changed. It was a system that consumed itself from within. The most critical problem, the demographic disease that would ultimately prove fatal, was what the ancients called oliganthropy, a shortage of men. The entire Spartan state rested on the small, exclusive body of full citizens, the homoioi, or equals. To be a citizen, a man had to be born of 2 Spartan parents. He had to pass the rigorous inspection at birth. He had to survive the Agoge, and he had to possess enough wealth from his hereditary estate, his kleros, to contribute his monthly dues to his dining mess. Every single one of these criteria was a bottleneck, and over time, the number of men who could meet all of them began to shrink at an alarming rate. The constant warfare, which was the very purpose of the state, took a steady toll. Every Spartan killed in battle was a loss that was hard to replace. The system of eugenics at birth, which discarded any imperfect infant, further limited the population pool. But the most significant factor was economic. The kleroi, the estates that supported each citizen, were hereditary. Over generations, as a father divided his land among his sons, or as estates were consolidated in the hands of wealthy families through marriage to heiresses, an increasing number of men found themselves without enough land to support their mess. Contributions. As we have seen, a man who could not pay his dues was immediately stripped of his citizenship and cast into the ranks of the inferiors. This created a vicious spiral. With every war, with every failed harvest, with every unequal inheritance, the number of full Spartan citizens dwindled. At the time of the Persian Wars in the early 5th century BC, it is estimated that there were around 8,000 Spartan hoplites. By the time of their great victory over Athens in 404 BC, that number had already fallen significantly. A generation later, at the pivotal Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, the Spartans could barely field 2,000 citizens. The pyramid of power was shrinking, its base becoming terrifyingly narrow. A system designed to create a master race was, in fact, breeding itself out of existence. As the number of Spartiates declined, their reliance on the Helots and on non-citizen soldiers, the Perioiko who lived in the surrounding towns, grew ever greater. But these groups had no loyalty to the Spartan state. Why should a Helot fight for his master, or a Perioikos for a city that denied him political rights? The famed Spartan army was becoming a hollow shell, its core of true believers, shrinking with every passing year. The second major factor in Sparta's decline was its complete inability to adapt to a changing world. The victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War was, ironically, the beginning of the end for Sparta. Suddenly, this insular, land-based power found itself as the leader of a vast maritime empire, with tribute and gold pouring in from across the Aegean. The Spartan system was simply not equipped to handle this. Spartan commanders sent abroad to govern the newly acquired territories were hopelessly corrupted by the sudden exposure to wealth and luxury. These were men who had been raised in a system of enforced austerity, and they had no immunity to the temptations of power and bribery. The very wealth that came from their victory began to corrode the discipline and equality that had made them strong. Their political system was equally incapable of managing an empire. It was designed for conservatism and internal control, not for sophisticated diplomacy or the administration of foreign subjects. The Spartans were clumsy and brutal imperial masters, quickly earning the hatred of the Greek cities they now controlled. Their foreign policy was often inept, driven by the short-term and often paranoid decisions of the ephors. The final blow came not from internal decay, but from a military innovation that rendered the classic Spartan phalanx obsolete. For centuries, the Spartans had been the masters of the hoplite battle, but in the 4th century BC, a brilliant Theban general named Epaminondas devised a new set of tactics. He realized that a standard phalanx was equally strong along its entire front. He reasoned that if he could achieve a decisive victory on one section of the battlefield, the rest of the enemy line would collapse. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, Epaminondas put his theory into practice against a Spartan army led by one of their kings. He broke with all military tradition. Instead of distributing his troops evenly, he massively reinforced the left wing of his own phalanx, arranging it into a column 50 ranks deep. He weakened his center and his right wing, ordering them to advance obliquely and delay engagement. The battle thus became a contest between the massively reinforced Theban left wing and the traditional Spartan right wing. The result was a catastrophe for Sparta. The sheer weight of the deep Theban column punched through the Spartan line, killing the Spartan king and a huge portion of the Spartiate citizens present. For the first time in centuries, a Spartan army had been decisively defeated in a major land battle. The myth of Spartan invincibility was shattered. The defeat at Leuctra was more than just a military loss. It was a psychological and demographic cataclysm. In the aftermath, Epaminondas invaded Laconian territory itself, and in a move that destroyed the very foundation of the Spartan state, he liberated the entire region of Messenia, freeing the Helots there after centuries of servitude. With the stroke of a pen, Sparta lost half of its territory and the majority of its enslaved workforce. Its economic and social system collapsed overnight. The decline after Leuctra was swift and irreversible. Stripped of its economic base and with its citizen body decimated, Sparta became a second-rate power, a shadow of its former self. It lingered on for a few more centuries, a strange and sad tourist attraction, visited by Romans who were curious to see the remnants of its bizarre and brutal customs. But its time as a great power was over. The tragic irony of Sparta is that its downfall was a direct result of its success. The system that was so perfectly designed to preserve a specific way of life made it impossible for that way of life to evolve. By sacrificing everything for the sake of military discipline and internal control, Sparta created a society that was brittle, inflexible, and ultimately unsustainable. It was a state that perfected the art of training its sons to die, but had forgotten how to teach them to live. The great machine, designed for perfect order, had finally consumed its own cogs, grinding itself to a halt in the dust of a changed world. At the very heart of the Spartan myth lies a single, powerful word, homoeoi. It means the equals or the peers. This was the name the Spartan citizens gave themselves, a name that projected an image of perfect monolithic unity. It evoked a society where every citizen was a brother, every warrior an equal peer in a great enterprise, all sharing the same food, the same training, and the same unshakable devotion to the state. This ideal of equality was one of Sparta's most potent pieces of propaganda, an image that inspired admiration and envy across the Greek world. But it was a carefully constructed illusion. For every Spartan who stood proudly as one of the equals, there were others who lived in the shadows of the system, men who had once been Spartans but were no longer, men who had been born in Sparta, but were never allowed to be true citizens. These were the outcasts, the inferiors, the tremblers, and their existence reveals the brutal truth. The Spartan system was not just a machine for making citizens. It was a machine for creating failure, and it used the terror of that failure as its most effective tool of social control. The largest and most tragic of these groups were the hypomaiones, a term that translates grimly as the inferiors. A man was not born an inferior. He was made one. These were former Spartan citizens, men who had been born into the elite, who had survived the judgment at birth, and who had endured the full horror of the Agoge. They were, by training and by blood, Spartans, but they had failed in the one crucial test that underpinned the entire system of citizenship, the economic test. As we have seen, every Spartan citizen was required to make a monthly contribution to his communal dining mess, the Syssitia. This contribution of barley, wine, cheese, and figs came from his hereditary estate, his chloros. If, for any reason, a man could not make his payment, the consequences were instant and absolute. He was expelled from the mess, and in that moment his citizenship was extinguished. This could happen for a variety of reasons. His land might have been ravaged in an earthquake or by an invading army. A series of bad harvests could ruin him. But the most common cause was a slow generational process of impoverishment. While a kleros was, in theory, indivisible, in practice, a father with multiple sons would have to find ways to divide his resources, and over time, many plots of land simply became too small to produce the required surplus. For the more wealthy, families could accumulate more land through strategic marriages with heiresses, concentrating the limited resources of the state into fewer and fewer hands. This meant that with every generation, a growing number of men were pushed below the economic threshold of citizenship. They became the hypomeons. The life of an inferior was one of profound humiliation. He still lived in Sparta, but he was no longer a part of its civic life. He could not vote in the assembly, he could not hold office, and he was barred from the Syssitia, the very center of Spartan male society. He was a ghost in his own homeland, a walking reminder of failure. It is likely they were still required to serve in the army, but they would have done so in a subordinate and dishonored capacity, perhaps as light-armed skirmishers rather than as hoplites in the phalanx. They were men trained for a single purpose, to be elite warriors who were denied the right to practice their profession with honor. Their existence was a constant source of anxiety for the ruling class. They were a disenfranchised and resentful population of fully trained soldiers living in the heart of the city, a potential source of sedition and conspiracy. If economic failure was a disgrace, then martial failure was a form of damnation. The most despised figure in Spartan society was the tresses, the trembler, the man who had shown cowardice in battle. The Spartan moral code was absolute on this point: victory or death. To survive a defeat by fleeing, by throwing down one's shield, or by surrendering to the enemy was not seen as a human response to terror. It was seen as a treason against the very essence of Sparta. A man who returned home under such circumstances faced a punishment that many considered worse than death. A living social Helot, the tresses was subjected to a systematic and ritualized public humiliation. He was stripped of all political rights. He was forced to wear a special, humiliating costume, a cloak with colored patches, to mark him out. He had to shave only half of his beard, making his disgrace visible to all who saw him. No one would speak to him. No one would share a fire with him. No one would exercise with him in the gymnasium. He had to give way to everyone else on the street. He was an untouchable. His disgrace extended to his family. No one would marry his daughters, effectively ending his lineage. He was a source of pollution, a contamination that had to be isolated from the healthy body of the state. Life for a trembler was so unbearable that many chose to take their own lives rather than endure it. Their torment served as a terrifying lesson to every other Spartan soldier. Death on the battlefield was infinitely preferable to the life of a coward at home. Beyond these men who had been cast out of the citizen body, there were other groups who lived on the margins. One of the most interesting was a group known as the Partheni, or Sons of Virgins. According to the historian Herodotus, during the long and difficult First Messenian War in the 8th century BC, the Spartan men were away from home for so long that the city faced a demographic crisis. To ensure a new generation was born, a group of young men who had not gone to war were instructed to impregnate the unmarried Spartan women. The children of these unions, the Partheni, were raised as Spartans. However, when the war was over and the victorious army returned, these children were denied full citizen rights, as their parentage was considered irregular. Feeling cheated of their birthright, the Partheni organized a conspiracy against the state. The plot was discovered, but instead of executing them, the Spartans chose to exile them. This large group of disgruntled young men sailed to southern Italy and founded their own new city, Tarentum, which would become one of the great powers of Magna Graecia. This episode reveals that the Spartan system of exclusion could create real and dangerous political instability. Finally, there were the liminal figures of the Mothakes and the Neodamodes. The Mothakes were non-Spartan boys, often the illegitimate sons of Spartan fathers and Helot mothers who were raised as the foster brothers of true Spartan boys. They were permitted to participate in the full rigors of the Agoge. They were, in effect, culturally Spartan in every way. Some, like the brilliant General Sleepless, who won the Sicilian expedition for Syracuse, could rise to positions of great military command. Yet they were never granted the status of homeoi. They were eternally outsiders, useful tools of the state, but never true members of the club. The Neodamodes, or new men of the people, were Helots who had been granted their freedom in exchange for distinguished military service. As the number of Spartiates dwindled, the state was increasingly forced to rely on these freed slaves to fill the ranks of its army. But their freedom was precarious, and their status was ambiguous. They were no longer slaves, but they were certainly not citizens. This complex ecosystem of outcasts, inferiors and half-citizens, completely shatters the myth of the homooi. Spartan society was not a monolithic block of equals. It was a fiercely competitive and ruthless hierarchy, where the vast majority of the population, the Helots, were held in bondage, and even those at the top lived in constant fear of falling. The specter of disgrace of becoming an inferior or a trembler was a powerful whip used by the state to enforce conformity. The existence of these outcast groups was not a flaw in the system. It was a feature. They were the living embodiment. A failure, a constant, terrifying warning to every citizen of the brutal price of not being a perfect Spartan. We have journeyed through the institutions of Sparta, the brutal Agoge, the terrifying Crypteia, the rigid Syssitia. We have examined the lives of its people, the enslaved Helots, the warrior men, the formidable women, and the desperate outcasts. But now we must attempt to enter the most alien landscape of all, the Spartan mind itself. What kind of inner world, what form of psychology did this unique and unforgiving system create? To understand the Spartans is not just to know what they did, but to try to understand how they thought. The Spartan mind was a fortress, meticulously constructed from birth to defend the state from all threats, both external and internal. It was a mind shaped by a profound and all-pervading psychology of fear and control, a mental landscape that was as disciplined, as austere, and as brutal as the physical world they inhabited. The first and most prominent feature of this mental fortress was a deep and abiding xenophobia, a fear of the foreign. The Spartan state was pathologically suspicious of the outside world. This fear was institutionalized in the practice of xenolasia, the periodic and formal expulsion of all foreigners from Laconian territory. Visitors, traders, diplomats, artists, philosophers were not welcome in Sparta. The Spartans believed that outsiders brought with them dangerous and corrupting influences, new ideas about politics, a desire for luxury goods, a softness of character, and a spirit of critical inquiry. These were all seen as diseases that could infect the perfectly ordered body of their state. They sought to create a hermetically sealed society, a cultural quarantine zone, to protect the purity of their system. This was not the behavior of a confident people, but of a deeply insecure one, a society terrified that its rigid order was so fragile that it would shatter upon contact with any alternative way of life. Inside this fortress, the Spartan mind was disciplined to operate in a very specific way, most famously expressed through their laconic speech. As we have seen, this was more than just a preference for brevity. It was a form of mental training, a complete rejection of the rhetorical culture that was so prized in Athens. To the Spartans, the long, elaborate, and often emotional speeches of Athenian orators were a sign of weakness and deception. They were a way of twisting the truth, of making the weaker argument appear the stronger. The Spartan mind was trained for clarity, for decisiveness, and for a ruthless focus on the essential. Words were not for self-expression or for philosophical exploration. They were tools, weapons to be used with precision. The famous story of the Spartan response to the threat from Philip of Macedon illustrates this perfectly. Philip sent a message. "You are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city." The Spartans sent back a reply of a single word, "if." This was the laconic ideal in action, a response that was contemptuous, confident, and utterly devoid of wasted energy. It was the intellectual equivalent of a perfectly executed spear thrust. Beneath this veneer of hard-headed, rational discipline, however, the Spartan mind was deeply, almost primitively, superstitious. Their universe was not governed by logic or human will, but by the inscrutable and often terrifying whims of the gods. Their public and private lives were dictated by a rigid adherence to omens, oracles, and ritual. Before any major state decision, to go to war, to appoint a general, to pass a law of the gods had to be consulted, usually through animal sacrifice. And priest would examine the entrails of the sacrificed animal, and if the signs were deemed unfavorable, the entire enterprise would be abandoned, no matter how strategically urgent. Spartan armies were famously late to battles, like the great Battle of Marathon, because they refused to march until the full moon, a religious prohibition they dared not violate. This deep piety might seem like a contradiction to their pragmatic cruelty, but it was, in fact, an essential part of their psychology of control. By subordinating all human action to the will of the gods and the interpretation of ritual, they created another layer of immutable order. It was a way of justifying their conservatism. The laws of Lycurgus were not to be changed because they were divinely inspired. It was a way of controlling even their kings. A king whose sacrifices were consistently unfavorable could be seen as having lost the favor of the gods and could be deposed. This rigid superstition was a rejection of individual agency. It ensured that every Spartan, from the lowest hoplite to the king himself, was a servant not just of the state, but of a cosmic order that could not be questioned. Ultimately, the goal of the entire Spartan system was the systematic annihilation of the individual self. From the moment a child was born, it was taught that its life was not its own. The bonds of family were deliberately severed and replaced with loyalty to the herd and the state. The concept of private life was obliterated by the communal living of the Agoge and the Syssitia. The pursuit of personal wealth was, in theory, made impossible by the rejection of coinage and the public shaming of luxury. The very idea of self-expression through art or elaborate speech was suppressed. The desired outcome was a man who did not think in terms of I, but only in terms of we. He was to find his identity not in his own unique thoughts, feelings, or ambitions, but in his role as a Spartan. His personal honor was indistinguishable from the honor of his unit and his city. His greatest personal ambition was to die in a way that would bring glory to the collective. This psychological hollowing out was perhaps the most profound and brutal reality of Spartan life. It was a form of mental enslavement that was, in its own way, as complete as the physical enslavement of the Helots. It created soldiers of unmatched discipline and courage, men who truly did not fear death. But it did so at the cost of everything that makes a life recognizably human: love, creativity, curiosity, and the freedom to be oneself. The Spartan mind, then, was a paradox. It was sharp but narrow, brave but fearful, rational in its tactics but deeply irrational in its beliefs. It was a mind stripped bare, polished down to a single hard point of purpose. This was the source of its formidable, focused power. But it was also the source of its ultimate tragedy. It was a mind incapable of adaptation, of innovation, of empathy. It was a fortress built so well that it became a prison, a perfectly ordered inner world that had no way of coping when the world, outside its walls, refused to obey its rigid and unforgiving rules. And so our journey into the heart of Sparta comes to a close. We have walked in a land that was beautiful and terrifying, a society that was both disciplined and cruel. We have moved past the heroic mirage of cinematic glory and have tried to understand the cold, hard logic that underpinned this unique civilization. We have seen that the source of Sparta's legendary strength was also the source of its fatal weakness, a deep, profound, and all-consuming fear, the fear of their enslaved. Helot population was the forge in which the Spartan soul was hammered into shape. It was this fear that led them to create the Agoge, a system of education that was, in truth, a factory for producing human weapons. It was this fear that drove them to inspect their own children at birth and discard the imperfect, to turn their women into breeders of soldiers, and to transform their very society into a permanent military camp. It was a fear that compelled them to sacrifice their art, their commerce, their freedom, and ultimately their own humanity on the altar of state security. For a time, this brutal formula worked. It gave them the discipline to create the most formidable army of their age and the stability to dominate Greece. But the price was immense. The system that demanded perfection left no room for error, no room for compassion, and no room for change. By creating a society of perfect cogs, it forgot how to build a society that could adapt and grow. The very institutions designed to preserve Sparta were the ones that led it to its inevitable decline, a slow self-consumption that left it a hollow shell of its former might. The story of Sparta is a powerful and unsettling cautionary tale. It asks us to consider the true meaning of strength, of freedom, and of society itself. It forces us to confront the terrifying logic that can arise when fear is the primary architect of a state, and it serves as a timeless reminder that a society that cannot bend will in the end inevitably break. As we return now to our own world, let us remember the silent testimony of the Spartan ruins, a quiet monument to a people who achieved a terrifying kind of perfection, and in doing so engineered their own lonely and tragic end. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the brutal realities of the Spartan world.